Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe my channel. Enjoy the listening. Complex alien code, simple human fix, the reboot that saved the day. The Galactic Academy's main auditorium was a sight to behold. Towering walls of crystalline material shimmered under the artificial light, refracting colors that danced across the enormous dome ceiling. At the center of the vast chamber stood rows upon rows of sleek examination pods, each designed to provide an isolated workspace for the Academy's top students. The air hummed with anticipation as young intellectuals from various species prepared for their final programming exam. This was no ordinary test. It was the culmination of years of study, a challenge meant to push the brightest minds of the galaxy beyond their limits. Only those who passed with distinction would be granted the prestigious rank of Master Technologist, an honor that guaranteed high-ranking positions in research institutes, interstellar corporations, and even government agencies. Seated among the alien prodigies was Scott Collins, the Academy's only human student. He had earned his place through sheer determination, surprising many with his adaptability and problem-solving skills. Despite initial skepticism from both faculty and classmates, he had proven himself time and again. Yet, as he sat before his examination console, he couldn't help but feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him. A holographic countdown hovered above the examination hall, glowing with a faint blue light. The moment it hit zero, a calm yet authoritative voice filled the air. Commencing final exam. All candidates engage your terminal. Scott exhaled slowly and placed his hands on the console. The screen before him flickered to life, displaying lines of alien code scrolling at an alarming speed. At first glance, everything appeared normal until it wasn't. The system glitched, text scrambling into unreadable symbols before settling into a chaotic mess of overlapping commands. Then a single line of instructions stabilized on the screen. Task: restore functionality to the AI mainframe. Time limit: 6 hours. Failure to resolve system corruption will result in automatic disqualification. He glanced to his left where a tall, four-armed Velian was already typing at a speed that made his fingers blur. To his right, a sleek scaled Orion had activated a secondary interface, splitting her attention between multiple windows filled with complex computations. Across the hall, a dozen other students were already deep in their analysis, their specialized ocular enhancements and neural implants allowing them to process information far faster than any unmodified human ever could. Scott cracked his knuckles and leaned in closer. He had expected something difficult, but this wasn't just any malfunction. This was intentional chaos. The Academy had deliberately inserted a series of cascading failures, each designed to trigger the next in an unrelenting cycle. Every line of code he attempted to stabilize would be overridden by another set of conflicting instructions. He'd opened a diagnostic tool, running a preliminary scan to assess the extent of the corruption. As expected, the results were alarming. The AI core had fragmented into hundreds of interdependent subroutines, each one feeding erroneous data into the next. It was a mess of redundancies, recursive loops, and corrupted memory blocks. The complexity of the failure was staggering. Scott tapped his fingers against the console, trying to formulate a strategy. Meanwhile, his peers had already begun their attempts to isolate and repair individual subsystems. A few desks away, a Scythian student activated a holographic projection of the AI's internal architecture, using his three-fingered hands to rearrange code blocks in midair. Another competitor, a towering Ristle with bioluminescent markings along his arms, was deep in concentration, his eyes flashing as he transmitted commands directly into the interface through a neural link. Scott knew he couldn't compete with them in raw processing speed. Instead, he relied on intuition, experience, and most importantly, the understanding that sometimes the simplest approach was the best. He navigated through the system logs, searching for the moment the corruption had begun. If he could identify the source, he might be able to backtrack and find a solution. As he scrolled through layers of diagnostic reports, he noticed something peculiar. The AI's malfunction hadn't been gradual. It had occurred all at once. A complete system collapse triggered by a single, seemingly insignificant function. The timestamp showed that the failure had begun the moment the exam had started. That didn't make sense. A system as advanced as this one wouldn't just break the instant it was activated unless. Scott frowned. He pulled up the AI's resource allocation logs and cross-referenced them with the memory usage over the past few minutes. What he saw confirmed his suspicion. The AI wasn't failing because of a complex internal error. It was failing because it was overloaded. The exam had deliberately forced all subsystems to run at full capacity simultaneously, creating a bottleneck that spiraled out of control. His first instinct was to laugh. Every other student was working under the assumption that they needed to fix an intricate computational failure, when in reality, the entire system was suffering from something far simpler: too many processes running at once. He leaned back in his chair, watching as the others raced against time, their fingers flying across interfaces as they meticulously dissected each layer of the AI's code. Some of them had started implementing rollback sequences, others were rewriting data structures from scratch, and a few were attempting to bypass the corruption entirely. None of them had considered the most obvious solution. Scott sighed. He knew what he had to do. The question was, would the Academy accept it? He shook his head. It didn't matter. The objective was to restore functionality, not impress the judges with unnecessary complexity. Taking a deep breath, he moved his hand to the console and prepared to execute the simplest fix imaginable. Scott watched as the tension in the examination hall grew with every passing minute. The hum of data streams and the frantic tapping of keys filled the air. Alien students were deep in concentration, their faces reflecting a mixture of frustration and determination. The challenge was proving far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Across the room, a Rissel student gritted his teeth, his bioluminescent markings flickering erratically. His neural interface pulsed as he attempted another override, but the moment his code entered the system, the AI rejected it with an error message that scrolled across his display in sharp red letters. He cursed under his breath, his hands clenching into fists. He had been working for nearly an hour, yet he had made no visible progress. To his right, a Verilyn with 4 dexterous hands worked on 3 different command prompts simultaneously. His tendrils twitched with each keystroke, his focus so intense that he barely noticed the sweat forming on his brow. Every few minutes, he glanced at his secondary monitor where a detailed simulation of the AI's architecture played out. Each failed attempt caused the virtual model to destabilize, collapsing into a tangled mess of overlapping nodes and corrupted pathways. A few rows away, an Aryan student with shimmering scales had taken a different approach. She had divided the AI into separate instances, isolating one corrupted process at a time. Theoretically, it was a sound strategy, but it required a level of precision that few could maintain under pressure. Every time she corrected one error, another unexpected failure cascaded through the system, undoing her progress in an instant. Scott observed all of this with growing amusement. It was clear that everyone had fallen into the same trap, assuming that the solution required brute force programming rather than a fundamental reassessment of the problem itself. He had already deduced that the AI failure was due to system overload rather than an actual breakdown in functionality. Still, he hesitated. If he acted now, he would finish the exam in minutes while everyone else would continue struggling for hours. Would the professors even accept such a simple solution? The Galactic Academy valued complexity, innovation, and rigorous problem-solving. A solution that bypassed all of that might be seen as an insult rather than an achievement. His eyes flickered to the front of the room where the exam's proctor, a stern-faced Zorian, watched over the students with an unreadable expression. The Zorian's 6 golden eyes moved in synchronized patterns, scanning the room like a machine, studying each student's progress or lack thereof. His species was known for its patience and analytical mindset, yet even he seemed troubled by how long the test was taking. Scott sighed and turned back to his screen. He had no interest in playing a pointless waiting game. If the Academy rejected his solution, so be it. He had never been one to overcomplicate things just to meet someone else's expectations. He positioned his fingers over the keyboard, preparing to enter the simplest command imaginable. But just as he was about to type, a sudden noise caught his attention. A loud crack echoed through the chamber, followed by a sharp intake of breath. The Aryan student flinched as sparks erupted from her console. Her eyes widened in alarm as her hands jerked away from the screen where an ominous warning flashed in bold crimson text. Warning! System overload imminent. Critical failure detected. The reaction was immediate. The villain next to her froze mid-typing, his tendrils stiffening as he glanced at her display. The Rissel student abandoned his debugging process and turned toward the disturbance. Murmurs rippled through the hall as other competitors noticed the flashing alert on her screen. Before anyone could process what was happening, another station malfunctioned. A deep, guttural curse came from the far side of the room as a Lupin student yanked his interface away from his console, his screen flickering erratically before going completely dark. One by one, other stations began showing similar errors. Some flickered uncontrollably while others shut down entirely. The system was destabilizing at an alarming rate. Scott's fingers hovered above his keyboard as he watched the chaos unfold. This wasn't part of the test. The Academy might have designed the AI to be difficult, but it wouldn't risk allowing a total system collapse. Whatever was happening now was beyond what the professors had anticipated. The Zorian Proctor stepped forward, his gaze scanning the failing stations. His expression remained impassive, but the way his fingers tightened against his datapad betrayed a hint of concern. All students remain seated, he ordered, his voice calm yet firm. The exam is still in progress. Do not attempt to leave your stations. His words did little to ease the rising tension in the room. Some students exchanged uneasy glances, while others stubbornly continued working, determined to salvage their progress. But Scott could see the truth. They were wasting their time. The AI wasn't just malfunctioning, it was self-destructing. The entire system was caught in a feedback loop, consuming its own resources faster than it could process new commands. Left unchecked, it would collapse completely, erasing all progress and rendering the entire exam void. The Academy's technicians would have to reboot the system manually, delaying the test for days, possibly even weeks. Scott exhaled through his nose. He didn't have time for this nonsense. Without waiting for permission, he reached down and pressed a single key, Ctrl plus Alt plus Del. The screen dimmed for a fraction of a second before a simple prompt appeared. Restart system, yes/no. He selected yes without hesitation. A wave of silence swept through the hall as his console powered down, then rebooted. The moment it came back online, all system errors vanished. The AI core reinitialized, its corrupted data purged in an instant. The examination prompts reappeared, good as new, as if nothing had ever gone wrong. Scott leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms above his head. Well, that was easy. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, one by one, heads turned toward him. Confusion, disbelief, and outright shock spread across the faces of his peers. The Aryan student who had nearly crashed the system moments ago stared at him with wide eyes. The Verulin's tendrils twitched erratically, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to form words. Even the Rissel student, who had been aggressively working through his calculations, seemed at a loss for what to say. Scott arched an eyebrow. What? Did none of you think to try that? No one responded. The Zorian Proctor took a step forward, his golden eyes narrowing as he studied Scott's screen. He tapped a few commands on his datapad, verifying the status of the AI. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of something Scott couldn't quite place. You resolved the failure? Scott shrugged. Yeah, the system wasn't broken. It was overloaded. A simple reset cleared the memory cache and stopped the feedback loop. The room remained silent. Then, from the far end of the hall, a single voice muttered in disbelief. He just turned it off and on again. A ripple of astonishment spread through the students, some of them exchanging incredulous glances, while others stared at their own malfunctioning screens, realization dawning far too late. Scott sighed, resting his chin on his hand. He had a feeling this was going to be a long conversation. The stunned silence in the examination hall stretched on longer than Scott had expected. He had assumed there would be some kind of reaction, perhaps some quiet grumbling from the more competitive students, or maybe even a few frustrated sighs. But no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the entire room had frozen in place, each student still processing what had just happened. Its only sound came from the faint hum of active consoles, the systems rebooting smoothly now that the AI core had stabilized. Scott drummed his fingers idly on the desk, waiting. He had already passed the exam. Of that he was certain. The task had been to restore the AI's functionality, and he had done exactly that. Whether the Academy's professors would actually accept such an embarrassingly simple solution was another question entirely, but at this point he couldn't bring himself to care. A movement in the corner of his vision caught his attention. The Rissel student had finally shaken off his shock and was staring at his own console as if it had personally betrayed him. His bioluminescent markings pulsed erratically, a clear sign of agitation among his species. He muttered something under his breath before turning his gaze to Scott, disbelief still lingering in his narrowed eyes. The Verulin was the next to react. His tendrils, which had gone eerily still during the initial realization, now twitched with barely contained frustration. His four hands hovered above his console, his fingers flexing as if he was struggling to decide whether to keep working or admit defeat. His throat pulsed as he let out a deep, guttural exhale, his shoulders visibly slumping. From the other side of the room, the Aryan student sat completely still, her shimmering scales catching the dim light as she stared unblinkingly at her screen. Her expression was unreadable, but the stiffness in her posture betrayed her disbelief. Then finally, the first voice broke through the silence. This is absurd. The Verulam's voice was sharp, his words carrying an incredulous edge. You mean to tell me that after hours of calculations, after all the advanced problem-solving techniques, after everything we've been taught, the correct answer was to simply restart the system? Scott glanced at him and shrugged. Pretty much. The Verulam let out a strangled noise that sounded like a mixture of frustration and resignation. His tendrils curled slightly before unfurling again, his hands coming to rest on the console as he exhaled deeply once more, this time slower. I refuse to believe this is the intended solution, he said, shaking his head. It can't be. This is the Galactic Academy. They don't hand out top honors for something so primitive. Scott smirked. Doesn't matter what you believe. It worked. Another murmur swept through the hall, this time more agitated. The students who hadn't spoken yet were now whispering amongst themselves, debating in hushed tones. Some of them, Scott could tell, were furious, either at themselves for not thinking of it first, or at the academy for setting up an exam that had an answer so insultingly simple. Others, however, seemed to be on the verge of laughing at the sheer ridiculousness of it all. The Zorian proctor, who had been silently observing the reactions, finally took a step forward. His golden eyes remained locked onto Scott's face, his expression as unreadable as ever. He lifted his datapad, tapping a few commands before speaking. All students, cease your work. The examination has concluded. A ripple of disbelief spread through the hall. A few students hesitated, their hands still hovering over their keyboards as if unable to accept that it was really over. Others leaned back in their seats, some sighing in frustration, others shaking their heads in a mix of disbelief and reluctant admiration. The proctor turned his gaze to the upper level of the examination chamber, where the academy's senior professors had been observing from behind a glass panel. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then one of the professors, an aged Zealand with deep violet skin and intricate gold markings along his temples, leaned forward and activated the intercom. Scott Collins, his voice rang through the hall, smooth and composed, approached the central podium.